or information security. I'm going to let her introduce herself, but please welcome her to the front.
Thanks, everyone. I just want to get something out of the way. When I came in and you had that random number generator up, the first search result was true random number generator. And I really wanted to say there is no such thing as true classical random number generator. Unless they're using a quantum computer, it's not true. Yeah, and I know that because I did a PhD in quantum information. I know you're thinking, how did I end up being a hacker from doing a PhD in physics? But I don't know, at some point halfway through my PhD, I decided I actually want to be a hacker, and I don't want to spend my time in a dark lab looking at an oscilloscope. I want to spend it in a dark room looking at a terminal. So it makes a big difference. Unfortunately, I can't give you many useful tips on how to get into security. There's always a little bit of luck involved, but if you think you may enjoy it, it's definitely worth giving it a try, at least a few times, because sometimes you may try something and you think you just have a bad luck and it doesn't work out and you think I don't really like this or it's not good for me. But then you may give it another chance like a year later and you find that you actually love it. So that's me. I'm not very good at introducing myself or my talk, but because you probably forgot what the title of my talk was, I'll just remind you. I'll be talking about trust on the internet. And I'll cover a whole lot of topics, but unfortunately I won't be able to get into details on any of the topics. My slides will be distributed later, so if something goes past your head, don't worry. And you can always get in touch with me if you want to know more. So on the internet, every communication is using a bunch of protocols, and each of those protocols are layered on top of each other. And different hardware, software components are responsible for processing every frame. So let me just quickly go over this. You have network interface cards, which process the lowest levels, and then you've got the operating system kernel, which will deal with protocols such as IP, and then you've got your user applications. But just let's look at local networks. And for two machines on a local network to talk to each other, they need to know each other's IP addresses and MAC addresses. The MAC addresses are they're built into the network card, into the firmware of the network card, and the IP address is set by the operating system. And so you have a few devices on each local network, and in order to talk to any machine on the internet, they have to go via a router. And it's the router's responsibility to say which packet from the internet will go to which machine on the local network. But within the network itself, any machine can talk to any other machine without going via the gateway or the router. And the local network is considered a trusted zone. Normally, machines belong to people who know each other, or at least there is some sort of implied trust there. And there is the assumption that the router tells each machine which IP address to take. So kind of there is some trust in the router. But that's not actually the case because a machine can choose its own IP address. And furthermore, they can actually change the MAC address of their network card as well, even though that one's built into the firmware. And so this leads to a whole bunch of attacks possible on the local network where a malicious machine can read or modify data. They can impersonate other machines that you know and trust. And there are various DNS attacks I'll look at, which can be used for phishing and some more attacks. So that sounds pretty bad, but there are a few things you can do. First of all, maybe you want to use your own network, or maybe if you're using your flatmate's Wi-Fi, you can take control, but maybe not. And of course, don't connect to untrusted networks. But the other thing you can do is obviously use encryption wherever possible. And the most common protocol for encryption is TLS. And encryption is good not just for privacy. Like we all know that encrypted data looks like mumbo jumbo, and you can only make sense of it if you have the encryption key. But encryption is also used for authentication, where a server needs to authenticate to you. So, for example, a server has a claim for their identity, saying, for example, I'm Google, and there is a signature there, and the signature looks like Google's signature. But in order to prove that that machine really created that signature, it is encrypted with the private key of that machine, and only that machine has access to the private key. And any machine on the internet can verify the signature by decrypting it using the public key. So that's one way to authenticate, but then the same principle is also used for ensuring the integrity of data transmitted, where, for example, instead of the signature, you have a checksum of the message, or maybe the entire message is encrypted, and this prevents modification of the message, so you can trust that the message you're receiving really is identical to the one that was sent by the server. And so together, the authentication and integrity establish the trust between the parties communicating. So there are a bunch of protocols for encrypting. And as I said, the most common one is TLS or SSL, which is for some reason, it used to be SSL, and then after version 3, they decided to rename it to TLS and start the versioning again from 1. I don't know why, but it's the same protocol. And there is also the pretty good privacy, and there are probably a bunch more which I don't know about. But I'm only going to talk about SSL today. During the SSL handshake, the client will send so the handshake is used to establish the shared encryption key, which will be used to encrypt the data between the server and the client. But they can't just transmit it in the clear text over the network, because then it won't be secret, or it may even be modified. So the client will first send a list of key exchange algorithms that it supports, and then the server will select the best one from that list that it also supports normally. And then it will send the client its certificate, which is the claim for its identity. And that certificate is signed using the private key of the server. So the client can then verify that using the public key of the server. And then the client will generate a random, probably not true randomly, but a random pre-master key. And then it will encrypt that key using the public key of the server. And that so that it can send it safely to the server and prevent anyone else on the network from learning that pre-master key. The server will be able to decrypt it using its private key, and only the server should be able to do that. And afterwards, the client and the server will each use that pre-master key to generate the shared secret according to some recipe based on the key exchange algorithm that they agreed to use. And then that shared secret will be used to encrypt the data symmetrically between the client and the server. So in this case, the server authenticates to the client using its certificate. Optionally, the client may also authenticate using a client certificate. And there is trust that the data integrity is preserved because it is encrypted. So obviously, the SSL certificate here plays a crucial role. And when you visit an HTTPS site, you can see its certificate. The browser knows whether that certificate is valid, and it knows whether it is trusted, because it has a built-in list of third-party certificate authorities which can sign certificates on behalf of other websites. So if that certificate is signed using the private key of one of those third-party authorities, then the browser will say, oh, good. But if it's not, then you'll see something like this. And browsers don't do a very good job at pointing out what the actual issue is or what the security concern is. So you are totally forgiven if you ignore those warnings and just proceed. But if you actually look a bit more closely, you'll see that you were trying to visit secure.bank, but the certificate presented, although it was trusted in this case, was actually for some other domain. It could have also said that it is for secure.bank, but it was not trusted because it wasn't signed by a verified third party. So you're wondering, why would I go to secure.bank and see a certificate for some other site? Well, you may be subject to a person-in-the-middle attack, or you may think that secure.bank was hacked. Although it is unlikely, because if the remote server was hacked, then the attackers would already have access to decrypted data, so they wouldn't need to replace their certificate. So I'm not into conspiracy theories. Let's just look at something much more likely, which is that you've got a hacker on the local network. So one way for an attacker to intercept and modify the connection is the so-called ARP spoofing. ARP is the protocol which is used to resolve an IP address to a MAC address. The IP address of the machine you want to communicate to. Before you can send it anything, you need to know the MAC address of its network card. And so when you want to talk to a machine on the internet, you need to go via the gateway. So let's say you want to learn the MAC address of the gateway. Because you don't know it, you have to send that question basically to all machines on the local network, and that's a broadcast. So you're sending your broadcast to everyone on the local network, and you're asking, hey, gateway, please tell me your MAC address. But maybe some random machine tells you its MAC address, and it says, yeah, I'm totally the gateway, please go via me. So you say, okay, please get me Google. And that machine may serve you any data that it wants. And your browser will think it's talking to Google. But the key point is that because that malicious machine on your local network does not possess the private key of Google, it will not be able to encrypt it using that private key. So it will actually encrypt it using its own certificate. And that's how the browser will know, that's how the browser will know something is off. So obviously you should not be using, you should not be logging into your accounts from untrusted devices, which may be pre-configured to trust some malicious certificates. And of course, you should not be ignoring those certificate warnings. But you're all security-aware people here. You never ignore those warnings. No need to object to that. Well, what if the attacker serves you plain text data, unencrypted? You won't see any warning. All you'll see is this. And let me ask you, how many times do you go to a website, any website, and every single time you check the search bar to make sure that the connection is actually encrypted? Yeah, I don't do that either, but that's okay. Because there are web browser extensions which can automatically upgrade your encryption. They can automatically upgrade your connection to HTTPS. They're not perfect, but they do a pretty good job. However, there are other ways remote attackers, not attackers on the local network, can get access to your private data on any website. You've probably heard about cross-site request forgery. The attack goes as follows. Let's say you are on your laptop, you're browsing, you're logged into secure.bank, and at the same time you have another tab open and you're looking for some cool hacker tips. That website that you're on can, via your browser, send a request to secure.bank, and because you are logged into the bank's website, that connection will use your current login session. So to secure.bank, it may look as if you're initiating that request, maybe for a money transfer. There may not be a way for secure.bank to say whether that request was initiated by another website you're visiting at the same time. Well, actually there is, and that's where the concept of web origin comes in. The origin is defined as the host name and the port number which initiated the connection, the request, the HTTP request. And the differences between two distinct origins may not always be dramatic, but even a single letter can make, basically it means those are two different origins as far as the browser is concerned. It doesn't matter whether they look the same. And they may even resolve to the same IP address. They're still distinct origins as far as the browser is concerned. And even if the host name is exactly the same, if the port number is different, that should also be a different origin, even though Microsoft browsers don't think that. So that all comes basically in the concept of the same origin policy, which is a policy all modern web browsers employ. And it basically says that if origin A attempts to connect to origin B, basically they initiate an HTTP request while you're browsing that site. Then if the two origins are different, the web browser will stop the connection. That's good from a security perspective, but it's not very practical because, as you know, nowadays, most web apps are hosted on different machines. They need to talk to third-party APIs. You need to talk to your fridge or something. And so there is legitimate use for one origin to initiate a connection to a different origin. And that's where the concept of cross-origin resource sharing comes in, kind of as a supplement or a complement to the same origin policy. It basically says that when one origin attempts to establish an HTTP request via your browser to a different domain, then that other domain, the target domain, needs to know which origin initiated the request, and the browser must tell it truthfully. The originating origin cannot force the browser to lie. So the browser will tell it which origin initiated the request, and the server can say yes or no, that connection is allowed or not allowed. And if it's not allowed, the browser will terminate it here. That's good in theory, but as I already said, some browsers don't do the right thing, but that's okay. We already know we shouldn't be using Internet Explorer. What's more interesting is that Firefox and Chrome, as of March this year, they allowed any site to access your private images on any other site. That was not by design. It was a bug that I found in March, and I reported it to Google and Mozilla, and they were pretty fast to fix it and also pay me. So that's good. My point here is that for cross-origin resource sharing to work correctly, both the target server, secure.bank in this case, needs to implement the correct responses, the correct policy, and your web browser needs to do the right thing and respect its response. But what you can do to minimize the risk of either one of them being broken is not visit multiple sites at the same time in different tabs, especially if you're logged into some sensitive site, and don't forget to log out before you close the tab. That's good, but there is a way to completely bypass the same origin policy. And that is, of course, DNS. It's always DNS. So the attack is called DNS rebinding. What's happening here is, let's say you're using a malicious DNS server, or maybe you're using a legitimate one that's just misconfigured. When you want to establish a connection to secure.bank, you are going to ask the DNS server for what the IP address of that website is. It's going to tell you the real IP address. So you're going to connect and log into your banking website. Then sometime later, maybe a minute, maybe 5 minutes, depending on how long your web browser caches the DNS results for, you're going to ask the DNS server again, just in case the IP address changed, which is possible. And this time, the DNS server will give you another IP address that belongs to a malicious machine. And then your browser will fetch some more data, as if you're continuing browsing secure.bank, but now you're fetching scripts, maybe JavaScript, from a different server. And that JavaScript can sit in the background and wait until your browser decides to ask again for the IP address sometime later, when the DNS server gives you the correct IP address again. And this time, the JavaScript that you fetched from the attacker's server can now freely talk to secure.bank and do whatever it wants. And as far as your web browser is concerned, all this time it was talking to secure.bank. So same origin policy out of the window. Well, why would I be using a malicious DNS server, you may ask? Well, you can have a malicious machine on the local network, which is pretending to be a DHCP server, or you may be using one of these abominations, multicast DNS or NetBIOS, which you shouldn't be using, or as I said, the DNS server may be misconfigured in a way that makes it vulnerable to DNS cache poisoning. And I'm not going to talk about this at all. but we will look at the attacks on the local network. And for example, let's take the top one, where you have a malicious machine which is pretending to be a DHCP server. When you first connect to a local network, you will ask what the DHCP server around here is, because that's the server that is going to give you all the settings for the network, such as your IP address and which DNS server to use. So because you don't know, you have to broadcast it again to everyone. And maybe the attacker will tell you, yep, that's me, I'm the DHCP. And as part of the DHCP protocol, it will tell you which DNS server to use to resolve your host names. So that's how you may end up using malicious DNS server. But what you can do is you can ignore those DNS servers that the DHCP server gives you, and you can use your own third-party server, such as Google's DNS, or there is a list on the internet for DNS servers you can find. And moreover, you can enforce the DNS connection to be encrypted if the remote DNS server supports that. That's all good. I'm getting there. Before I let you go, I just wanted to tell you what really happens when you start typing in the address bar. You know that you're either going to land in a search page if you were searching for something in your address bar, or you're going to establish the connection to the site if what you were typing was actually a host name. But how does the browser figure that out? It doesn't use artificial intelligence. It's pretty simple. First, it checks whether what you typed starts with a schema, such as http://. If it doesn't start with a schema, then it will check whether it's got any spaces in there, so more than one word. If you typed several words, then it's pretty clear that you were looking for something, so it will send that to your default search engine, for example, Google. If you typed a single word only, then maybe it was a host name, maybe it wasn't a host name. It will try to resolve that and see. If it doesn't resolve to a host name, then it will assume that it was a search term and again land you in the search page. If it did resolve to an IP address, then it will assume that was an HTTP URL. And from there on, just everything proceeds as if you had typed HTTP at the front. It will check, the browser will check whether you gave a port number. If you didn't give a port number, it will use the default one for the protocol, for example, 80 for HTTP. And from there on, it will check whether the remote server that you're connecting to now uses HTTP strict transport security. That basically says strict transport security tells the browser that this server always wants to use secure connection. So, for example, if a year ago you first connected to Google and Google told your browser, I always want to connect to HTTPS, please don't forget that, the browser will remember it. So anytime you connect to google.com, even if you start with HTTP, the browser will upgrade that to HTTPS. But if the browser doesn't know about this, it will simply establish the connection. And if it does know the web server uses strict transport security, it will upgrade it to HTTPS. Why am I telling you this? There should have been a red flag somewhere here that flashed. When you type a single word in the address bar, it tries to resolve it to an IP address. So when I go online and search for memes, before those search suggestions come up, the very first thing the browser will do is send a DNS request to resolve memes. And of course, apart from the obvious privacy issue, because DNS is not encrypted, the DNS server that you're using can tell you, yep, that's totally me, my host name is memes, and the browser will then connect to that host name over HTTP, and then that machine can serve a web page which looks identical to Google search results, but is actually malicious. So maybe as a final tip, you don't want to be using search in the address bar, but use those separate search bars on the side. Yeah, that's for me. I just want to say that secure.bank and haka.rs are actually legitimate host names. I only use them for example. I did not try to visit them, I only checked that hacker.rs was registered somewhere in Serbia. I know nothing about this. I'm not from Serbia. So I didn't visit them, nor should you. And if you want to know more about same origin policy and cross-site request forgery and how I found those bugs in Firefox and Chrome, you can visit my blog post at your InfoSec blog. And I'll also be speaking at this year's CHICON about it, so come and see me. And I've also included links to a few interesting articles about other attacks on the local network. And again, those slides will be distributed, so you don't have to write them down or anything. That's me and my unicorn. If you want to get in touch with me, send me an email, and thanks for listening. Oh, that was good.
Hey, they can still hear you, don't say anything. I was really excited to have Alex talk because I was blown away by her talk earlier this year on the browser security research that got her all that fat cash. And it's great that we have people in Wellington doing this stuff and also that they're willing to come and speak. So thank you very much.
Thanks for inviting me.
Do you want to take any questions?
Sure.
Haha,
Yeah, I
putting her on the
was so worried
spot.
I would run over time. That's why I asked to start early, but we've got time for questions.
Yeah, so any questions for Alex?
That's awkward.
Okay, sorry, there's a question here.
Sorry, I'm a little bit deaf. Well, yeah, if it's not your own network at home, then you can't really trust it. But what you can do is use a VPN, which encrypts all of your data, and you can avoid logging into sensitive sites while you're on untrusted networks. And also maybe look at installing a firewall on your machine, depending on which operating system you're using, so that other machines on the network can't talk to you. But yeah. Oh, look, it really, I oversimplified a lot of things because I can't go into technical details on any of the attacks. I'm not saying that every time you connect to some cafe Wi-Fi, you'll be hacked. It's not that easy, but it's possible, and it all depends on how the network is configured and how your operating system is configured, whether it's up to date. I don't want to be that guy to tell you to patch, but yeah, do install updates. Thanks.
Cool. Any other questions for Alex? Cool. So without any further ado, let's thank Alex for her talk. Thank you very much.